"You'll never be my wife," he said coldly. 2 years later, he saw her with the twins, and his world collapsed. Michael Blackstone had spent his life learning how to harden his heart, to treat emotions as weaknesses that could derail his rise to power. From the very beginning of his career he had built his reputation on cold decisiveness, on the ability to walk away from anything or anyone who threatened to distract him from his goals. By the time he was 35, he was the celebrated CEO of a corporation that stretched across industries, his name whispered with a mixture of fear and admiration in the highest circles of business. He had the kind of wealth that made him untouchable, the kind of authority that bent others to his will, and yet the more he achieved, the more ruthless he became, as though every victory demanded he prove again that nothing, not love, not friendship, not loyalty, could weigh him down. Julia had been one of the few people who ever glimpsed the man beneath the steel exterior. She was his assistant, intelligent and capable, but unlike others around him she did not flatter or scheme for favors. She looked him in the eye when she spoke, challenged him when he was unreasonable, and carried herself with quiet dignity that no amount of money could purchase. Over months of working late nights together, their relationship had shifted in ways neither acknowledged aloud. She had seen him smile when he forgot himself, she had felt the warmth of his hand brush hers when passing files, she had caught the rare moments of exhaustion in his expression when he thought no one was watching. For Julia, who had guarded her heart carefully, the realization that she had fallen in love with him was both terrifying and exhilarating. One evening, after another long day that bled into night, she gathered the courage to confess. The office was nearly empty, the glow of city lights flooding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the silence between them was heavier than usual. Julia stood by his desk, her hands trembling slightly as she told him that she cared for him, not as her boss but as a man, that she saw more in him than the world did, and that she dreamed of a future where he could let down the walls he had built so high. Her voice wavered but her gaze remained steady, her brown eyes shimmering with sincerity. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying her as though she were a problem to be solved rather than a woman bearing her soul. For a long moment he said nothing, and Julia's heart hammered with hope and fear. Then, in a tone colder than the glass and steel towers that surrounded them, he let out a short, humorless laugh and said the words that would change both of their lives, "You will never be my wife." The sentence cut through the air like a blade. Julia felt her breath catch, her body stiffening as though the floor had given way beneath her. His expression remained detached, as though he were delivering a quarterly report rather than destroying her heart. He had not shouted, had not insulted her, but the dismissiveness in his voice carried more cruelty than anger ever could. He turned back to the papers on his desk as though the matter were settled, as though her confession had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Julia left the office that night without another word, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that echoed her breaking resolve. She did not wait for him to call after her because she knew he would not. She did not allow herself to cry until she reached the solitude of her apartment, where the tears came hot and endless. The image of him, seated in his immaculate suit, dismissing her dreams with a smirk, replayed in her mind until exhaustion finally forced her into restless sleep. For Michael, the moment barely registered. He poured himself a drink, reviewed the next day's agenda, and convinced himself that he had done the right thing. Marriage, love, family, those were chains, and he was destined for freedom. He did not notice the silence that lingered in the office after Julia stopped coming in early or staying late, nor did he allow himself to wonder why his mornings felt heavier without her cheerful greetings. He buried the memory of her confession as quickly as it had occurred, filing it away in the drawer of regrets he refused to acknowledge. What neither of them knew was that the night Julia walked away was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something neither could have imagined, a journey that would test them in ways power and pride could never prepare them for. Julia left the city only a few weeks after that devastating night, carrying with her not just the sting of rejection but the determination to rebuild her life far from Michael Blackstone's shadow. The towering skyscrapers that once seemed full of promise now felt suffocating, their glass facades reflecting her broken hopes back at her with cruel clarity. She packed what little she owned into 2 battered suitcases and boarded a bus headed to a town she had never visited, drawn only by its distance from the world she wanted to forget. The journey was long and silent, filled with the rumble of the road and the echo of Michael's words playing endlessly in her mind. "You will never be my wife" had become a scar she could not erase, but beneath the pain burned a quiet flame of resilience. She refused to let that moment define her future. In the small town where she eventually settled, life was nothing like the dazzling pace of New York. The streets were narrow and lined with family-owned shops, the air carried the smell of fresh bread and wood smoke, and people smiled at strangers instead of brushing past them. Julia rented a modest apartment above a laundromat, its walls thin and its furnishings sparse, but to her it was a sanctuary where she could breathe again. She found work as a waitress in a local diner, a job that left her exhausted but gave her just enough money to survive. Each day she tied her hair back, slipped into a faded uniform, and smiled at customers even when her heart was heavy. The tips barely covered rent and groceries, but for the first time in months she began to believe she could start over. It was during those first fragile weeks that Julia's world shifted once again. She had been feeling unwell, dizzy spells and waves of nausea interrupting her shifts, but she blamed it on stress and exhaustion. When the symptoms persisted, she finally went to the small-town clinic. Sitting in the sterile room, clutching the edge of the chair, she heard the words that made her heart pound with a mixture of fear and awe: she was pregnant. And not with one child, she was carrying twins. The news left her reeling. The image of Michael's cold, dismissive face rose immediately in her mind, and for a moment she felt her knees go weak. How could she raise 2 children alone when she could barely take care of herself? Panic surged through her, but just as quickly it was replaced by something stronger. She placed her hand on her stomach, tears filling her eyes, and whispered a promise to the lives growing inside her. She would not let them suffer for his mistakes. She would love them enough for both parents. The months that followed were some of the hardest of her life. Pregnancy took a heavy toll on her body. Her feet swelled after long shifts at the diner, her back ached constantly, and she fought through morning sickness that lasted well into the evenings. Still, she kept working, every dollar carefully stretched to cover food and doctor visits. At night she sat alone in her small apartment, rubbing her growing belly and speaking softly to her unborn children, telling them stories about the world they would one day see. She described the kindness of the bakery owner downstairs, the bright colors of the autumn leaves, the songs she hummed as she cleaned tables at the diner. She promised them that although their father had turned his back, they would never feel unloved. Loneliness often pressed in like a weight she could not lift, especially when she saw other families together in the diner, fathers lifting their children onto their laps, mothers smiling as they shared meals. Julia would excuse herself to the back room, pressing a hand to her stomach and willing herself not to cry. But every time the despair threatened to consume her, the twins reminded her of their presence with small kicks and flutters that filled her with renewed strength. She began to think of them as her secret guardians, tiny souls pushing her forward when she felt weakest. By the time her due date approached, Julia had grown used to surviving on very little sleep and even less money, but her spirit had become unbreakable. She no longer dwelled on Michael's rejection with the same raw pain. Instead, she focused on the future she was about to hold in her arms. The fear remained, fear of the unknown, of raising 2 children alone, of failing them, but beneath it all was a fierce love that nothing could shake. The night before she went into labor, Julia stood by the small window of her apartment, looking out at the quiet street below. The snow was beginning to fall, blanketing the town in silence. She placed both hands on her swollen belly and whispered once more, promising her children that they would never know the emptiness of abandonment. She vowed that whatever the world demanded of her, she would give it, and she would never let them doubt that they were wanted. As the snow drifted down, she felt a deep calm settle over her. She was no longer just a woman abandoned by a powerful man. She was a mother, and soon she would meet the two souls who would give her life a meaning she had never known. The day Julia went into labor began with an icy wind rattling the windows of her small apartment. She woke before dawn, her body heavy and aching, the dull pain in her back unlike anything she had felt before. At first she tried to convince herself it was just another restless night, but soon the pain sharpened into waves that stole her breath and forced her to grip the edge of the bed until her knuckles turned white. Panic set in for a brief moment, the realization that she was alone crashing over her, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She had prepared for this, rehearsed the walk to the phone, rehearsed the call to the neighbor who had promised to drive her to the hospital when the time came. By the time the sun had risen, she was in the back of a beat-up sedan, the snow falling thick and silent around them as the driver rushed her through nearly empty streets. The hospital was small, nothing like the gleaming facilities she had visited in New York during company health checkups, but the nurses greeted her with brisk kindness, their voices steady, their hands confident as they guided her through the whirlwind of paperwork and preparation. Hours stretched into a blur of pain and exhaustion, but through it all Julia held on to the thought of the two little lives fighting their way into the world. When the cries finally filled the room, first one piercing and insistent, then another joining moments later, her tears fell freely, not from pain but from overwhelming relief. They placed the first baby in her arms, a tiny girl with shockingly dark hair plastered against her damp forehead, her blue eyes opening briefly before squeezing shut again. Then came the second, equally small, equally fragile, her features so similar it was as if Julia were looking at a mirror split in two. She whispered their names, Lily and Sophia, her voice shaking with wonder. The following days were a haze of sleepless nights, bottles, and endless worry. Julia sat in the narrow hospital bed, holding both girls close against her chest, marveling at how something so small could carry the weight of her entire existence. She traced their tiny fingers, their perfect eyelids, their soft curls, and with each breath they took she felt her own life expand beyond anything she had ever imagined. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but in that moment she understood what it meant to love without condition. She promised them silently that she would never let them feel unwanted, that she would shield them from the pain she had known. When they were finally released from the hospital, Julia bundled the girls in second-hand blankets and carried them carefully into the cold air. The apartment felt even smaller now, crowded by bassinets and the endless necessities of infants, but she found comfort in the sound of their breathing, in the way their presence filled the silence that had once seemed unbearable. Nights were long and grueling, with feedings every few hours, her body still aching from the strain of childbirth, yet every time she looked down at her daughters she felt a surge of strength she did not know she possessed. Exhaustion became her constant companion, but so did joy, woven tightly together in the fabric of her new life. As months passed, Julia learned the rhythms of motherhood. She learned that Lily cried louder and demanded attention with fiery persistence, while Sophia was quieter, her gaze deep and thoughtful even as a baby. She learned how to stretch her small income, buying only what was absolutely necessary, often skipping meals herself to ensure the girls had everything they needed. She learned to smile through her fatigue at the diner, to endure the pitying looks of customers who noticed her thin frame and tired eyes, because she carried with her the secret pride of knowing she was raising two miracles on her own. Loneliness remained, a shadow that followed her through the days, but it was softened by the laughter that slowly began to fill her home. When Lily and Sophia learned to roll over, she clapped until tears blurred her vision. When they giggled for the first time, she laughed with them, her heart swelling until it felt too large for her chest. Every milestone became a victory, proof that despite the odds, they were thriving. Sometimes, when she rocked them to sleep in the dim light of the apartment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might have been like if things had been different, if Michael had chosen to stay, if he had been there to see his daughter's first smiles. But those thoughts only deepened the ache inside her, so she forced them away, focusing instead on the warm weight of her children in her arms. 2 years slipped by in this way, a blur of struggle and love. Julia grew thinner but stronger, her hands rough from endless work but steady when she buttoned tiny coats or braided wisps of dark hair. Lily and Sophia grew into curious toddlers, their blue eyes bright and mischievous, their bond inseparable as they played and fought and laughed in the same breath. They filled every corner of the apartment with life, their voices echoing through the thin walls, their presence turning even the hardest days into something bearable. Julia sometimes wondered how she had managed to survive without them before, and she could not imagine a world in which they did not exist. Yet beneath the joy lingered a quiet fear, one she never voiced even to herself. She knew the day would come when her daughters would ask about their father, when they would look at their reflection in the mirror and wonder whose features they carried. And when that day came, Julia would have to decide how much of the truth to tell. For now, she pushed the thought aside, holding onto the fragile piece she had carved out of pain, unaware that fate was already moving to shatter the fragile distance between her new life and the past she had tried so hard to bury. Michael Blackstone's empire had grown larger than even he once imagined, his name etched into skyscrapers, his face plastered across magazines that hailed him as one of the most brilliant and ruthless business minds of his generation. He had more money than he could ever spend, more influence than many politicians, and yet the higher he climbed, the heavier the emptiness inside him became. He attended glittering galas where crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead and champagne flowed endlessly, yet he always found himself drifting toward the edges of the crowd, detached from the laughter and false admiration that surrounded him. The women he entertained were beautiful, polished, and eager to be seen at his side, but their voices blurred together, their presence leaving him with nothing but a deeper sense of isolation when the nights were over. In the quiet moments, when the city lights stretched endlessly beneath his penthouse windows, the silence pressed in on him until it became unbearable. It was in those hours of solitude that his thoughts betrayed him, circling back to the one woman he had tried to erase from his memory. Julia's face came unbidden into his mind, the way her brown eyes had looked at him with both strength and vulnerability when she told him she loved him, the way her voice had trembled with hope, the way he had crushed that hope with a single cruel sentence. He tried to push the memory away, burying himself in work, telling himself she was insignificant, that she had probably forgotten him entirely. But her image refused to fade. Sometimes, when he saw a woman in the street with her hair catching the sunlight, or when he heard a laugh that carried the same lightness hers once had, the ache inside him deepened until it left him restless and angry at himself for even caring. He told himself he had made the right decision, that love and marriage were chains that would have bound him, distracted him, weakened him. Yet the conviction that once fueled his ambition had begun to crumble. Board meetings felt hollow, each new acquisition failing to bring the thrill it once had. His colleagues noticed the change, mistaking his detachment for arrogance, but Michael knew it was something deeper. It was as if every success only highlighted the absence of something more meaningful, something he had once held in his hands and thrown away. At night, when he closed his eyes, he sometimes imagined what her life might look like now. He pictured her walking down unfamiliar streets, maybe holding a child's hand, maybe laughing with someone else who had given her the devotion he had denied her. The thought unsettled him in ways he did not want to admit. He had always prided himself on control, on never regretting his choices, but Julia had become the ghost that haunted him, not with anger or bitterness, but with the relentless question of what might have been if he had chosen differently. The emptiness grew sharper when he visited his sister one weekend. She had 2 young children who greeted him at the door with sticky hands and squeals of laughter, climbing into his lap as if he were the most important person in their world. At first, he had laughed awkwardly, trying to hide his discomfort, but as the evening wore on, he found himself staring at them with a kind of yearning he could not explain. Their innocence disarmed him, their trust unsettled him, and when he left that night, their faces followed him all the way back to his penthouse. For the first time, he began to question whether the empire he had built was enough to fill the hollow space inside him. Yet he never sought Julia out. Pride held him back, and so did fear, the fear that if he found her, he would discover she had moved on, that she was happy without him, that his absence had left no mark on her life. He convinced himself it was better not to know, better to continue living in the world he had constructed, even if it felt like a cage of his own making. Still, the gnawing ache persisted, a reminder that the man the world saw as invincible was, in truth, haunted by a single woman he had believed too easy to discard. As he stood in his office one evening, the skyline burning with the glow of sunset, Michael caught his reflection in the glass and barely recognized the man staring back at him. He saw the tailored suit, the hardened jaw, the icy eyes that intimidated entire boardrooms, but behind it all was a weariness he could not hide. For years he had told himself he was free because he had no ties, no weaknesses. Now he realized that freedom without love, without connection, was nothing more than emptiness dressed in gold. And somewhere, though he did not know where, Julia was living a life that no longer included him. The knowledge left him hollow, unaware that fate was already weaving their paths back together, preparing to confront him with the truth he had been running from for years. Michael had traveled to the small town on what was supposed to be a routine business trip, another ribbon-cutting ceremony for one of his company's expanding branches. He stepped out of the sleek black car in his usual immaculate light gray suit, the one tailored to perfection, every stitch designed to convey authority and control. His assistant briefed him on the schedule as photographers prepared to capture his practiced smile, but Michael's mind was elsewhere. He was weary from the endless cycle of contracts and press events, and the only reason he had agreed to attend personally was because the new branch was expected to become a cornerstone of the company's future. He intended to get through the day quickly, give a speech, shake a few hands, and return to the anonymity of the city where he could bury himself in work once more. The air in the small town felt different from what he was used to, sharp and fresh with the faint scent of blooming trees. As he walked down the main street toward the cafe where a meeting was scheduled with local investors, he noticed how people greeted each other by name, how they lingered to talk instead of rushing by. It was a world far removed from the polished but impersonal life he led. He was about to dismiss the observation as trivial when he heard it, laughter, high-pitched and bubbling, carrying through the air like music. It made him pause. There was something disarming in that sound, something that tugged at him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. He turned toward the source and saw them. A young woman stepped out of the cafe, holding the hands of two small children. For a moment his mind refused to believe what his eyes were showing him. The woman's dark brown hair caught the sunlight, her familiar profile so achingly recognizable that it knocked the breath out of him. Julia. She looked older, stronger, her posture more determined than he remembered, but her eyes, the deep brown eyes that had once searched his face for something he had refused to give, were the same. His chest tightened as though the air itself had turned to stone. Then his gaze dropped to the girls. They couldn't have been older than 2. Both had soft dark hair and the unmistakable blue eyes he saw every morning in his own reflection. They clung to Julia's hands with the ease of children who trusted her completely, their laughter ringing through the air as they pointed at something in the window display. In that instant, realization hit him like a physical blow. They were his. He didn't need a test, didn't need anyone to explain. The truth was etched in their faces, undeniable and merciless. The daughters he never knew existed were walking before him, alive, beautiful, and utterly foreign to the world he inhabited. Michael stood frozen, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. Memories flooded back, the night Julia confessed her love, the cruel words he had thrown at her, the way she had walked out of his life without looking back. He had convinced himself she had forgotten him, that she had moved on. Yet here she was, and she had not only moved on but had carried with her the greatest secret of his life. He felt an ache in his chest so sharp it bordered on pain, a mixture of shock, guilt, and something dangerously close to longing. Julia's eyes met his then. For a fleeting moment time seemed to stop, the noise of the street fading until there was only the weight of her gaze. He saw recognition flash across her face, followed by something darker, anger, mistrust, the instinct to protect. She immediately tightened her grip on the girl's hands and drew them closer, her body subtly positioning itself between him and them. It was a gesture so natural yet so damning that it made his stomach twist. She was shielding them from him, as though he were a threat rather than their father. Michael took a step forward, his lips parting to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? How could he ask for forgiveness when he had been absent for their entire lives? He wanted to kneel before the girls, to trace the curls of their hair, to hear their voices up close, but the barrier of Julia's cold stare kept him rooted where he was. For the first time in years, the man who had commanded boardrooms and empires found himself powerless, undone by two tiny children and the woman who had once trusted him with her heart. Julia did not linger. With a final glance, sharp as glass, she turned and guided the girls away, her back straight and unyielding. Michael stood on the sidewalk, his entire world tilting beneath him as he watched them disappear into the crowd. Every instinct screamed at him to follow, to demand answers, but another part of him knew this was not a confrontation that could be resolved with power or wealth. He had seen the truth, and the truth was devastating. He was a father. He had missed their first steps, their first words, the warmth of their little arms around his neck, all because he had chosen arrogance over love. As the noise of the town returned and his assistant hurried up with a tablet full of schedules, Michael barely heard a word. His mind was no longer on the expansion of his empire, nor on the investors waiting in the cafe. His entire being was consumed by the image of Julia with the girls, the life she had built without him, and the brutal certainty that he had lost years he could never reclaim. For the first time in his life, he felt fear, not of failure in business, but of the possibility that he might never be allowed into the world of the children who carried his eyes and his blood. That night, alone in his hotel room, Michael sat in the dark staring at his reflection in the window. The city outside was smaller than the one he had left behind, but it carried a weight he could not ignore. He pressed his hands to his face, feeling the sting of regret wash over him, and whispered to himself a truth he could no longer deny. He had been wrong. He had been cruel. And now, unless he could find a way to change, he risked losing the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The following days became unbearable for Michael, his mind consumed with the image of Julia and the two little girls whose blue eyes mirrored his own. He had thought himself prepared for every kind of challenge, every hostile takeover, every betrayal in business, but nothing had armed him for the crushing weight of seeing his daughters for the first time and realizing how much of their lives he had already missed. He found himself wandering the streets of the small town instead of attending meetings, scanning every cafe and park in hopes of catching another glimpse of them. His assistant grew nervous, shuffling schedules and fielding calls from furious board members, but Michael ignored it all. For the first time, he had something more important than business. When he finally saw Julia again, it was outside the same cafe. She had one of the girls on her hip while the other toddled beside her, clinging to her cardigan with chubby fingers. Michael approached cautiously, his heart hammering in a way he had never experienced in boardrooms or negotiations. Julia spotted him immediately, her expression hardening into a wall of suspicion and protectiveness. She shifted the child on her hip and angled her body so that both girls were behind her, her eyes narrowing as he drew closer. He stopped a few feet away, afraid that if he pushed too far, she would vanish again. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the silence filled with all the words left unsaid over the years. "I'm not here to take them from you," Michael finally said, his voice low and unsteady. It shocked him to hear the tremor in his own words, a vulnerability he hadn't shown anyone in years. Julia's lips tightened, but she said nothing, her gaze burning into him like fire. He wanted to explain, to beg, to tell her he hadn't known, but every excuse he tried to form died on his tongue. She turned abruptly, leading the girls away without responding, leaving him standing there in the middle of the street like a man stripped of everything. Michael didn't give up. He began appearing in quiet, unobtrusive ways. When Julia struggled to carry groceries, he was the one who quietly paid the bill before she reached the register. When he learned through whispers in town that one of the girls had fallen ill, he anonymously covered the hospital expenses, ensuring she had the best care the clinic could provide. He never announced himself, never demanded gratitude, but Julia wasn't foolish, she knew exactly who was behind it. Every time she saw him standing at a distance, watching with an expression that carried more regret than pride, she felt her defenses shake just slightly, though she refused to let him see it. The girls, however, noticed him in their own innocent way. One afternoon in the park, Lily, the more spirited of the twins, spotted Michael sitting alone on a bench. She toddled over, clutching a small toy in her hand, and stared up at him with those piercing blue eyes. For a moment Michael froze, terrified to move, but then she held out the toy as if offering it to him. His chest tightened painfully as he accepted it with trembling hands. Julia rushed forward, scooping Lily up, her eyes blazing with warning. Yet the moment lingered in Michael's heart, the first wordless connection between him and the daughter who didn't yet know who he was. In the weeks that followed, Michael found himself transformed. He canceled business trips, redirected meetings to his hotel in the town, and ignored the protests of his shareholders. He spent hours simply walking the same streets Julia did, not to stalk her but to prove he wasn't running away. He wanted her to see that he was staying, that he was willing to be present even if she hated him. Slowly, small cracks began to show in Julia's armor. She still kept her distance, but she no longer whisked the girls away at the first sight of him. Sometimes she allowed them to play in the park while he watched from across the lawn, his eyes never leaving them. The turning point came one rainy evening when Julia was caught outside with the girls, struggling to shield them with a thin umbrella as the downpour soaked through their clothes. Michael appeared suddenly, his car pulling to the curb, and without a word he stepped out, his jacket already in his hands. He draped it around the shivering children, his movements gentle and hesitant, as though afraid they might break. For the first time, Julia didn't push him away. She looked at him with a mix of exhaustion and something softer, something dangerously close to the trust she had once given him. That night, as he watched her carry the girls up the stairs to their apartment, he realized that actions, not words, would be the only way to earn his place in their lives. He couldn't undo the years he had missed, couldn't erase the cruelty of his rejection, but he could prove, day by day, that he was no longer the man who had once valued pride above love. And though Julia still locked her door against him, though she still guarded her daughters with fierce determination, Michael knew he had taken the first step toward redemption. It was a bitterly cold night when Julia woke to the sound of coughing from the small bedroom where her daughters slept. At first she thought it was nothing more than a restless dream, but when the cough grew harsher and she heard the ragged sound of shallow breathing, panic surged through her. She rushed into the room and found Sophia curled up in bed, her little face flushed with fever, her tiny chest heaving with every labored breath. Julia's heart pounded as she scooped the child into her arms, whispering soothing words that did nothing to calm the terror clawing at her throat. Lily stirred in the other bed, frightened by the noise, and Julia had to force herself to stay steady, to mask her fear for the sake of both girls. The small-town clinic was a blur of bright lights and hurried footsteps, doctors and nurses moving quickly as Julia clutched Sophia's hand and tried to answer questions through her tears. They spoke of infection, of complications that could worsen without immediate treatment, of the need for expensive medication and overnight monitoring. Julia felt her stomach drop when she saw the bill, the numbers swimming before her eyes as she realized she could never afford it. She tried to ask about payment plans, about alternatives, but the doctor's expression told her everything. Without immediate care, her daughter's condition could spiral into something far worse. Julia sat in the hallway outside the examination room, her head in her hands, trembling with exhaustion and despair. She thought of calling friends, but she had none close enough to lean on. She thought of selling what little she owned, but even then it would not be enough. For the first time since the twins were born, she felt truly helpless, crushed by the weight of her own limitations. She had promised her daughters she would always protect them, and now, when it mattered most, she felt she was failing. When Michael arrived at the clinic, she almost didn't recognize him. He appeared suddenly, striding down the hall with urgency in his step, his hair slightly disheveled as though he had left wherever he was without hesitation. She opened her mouth to speak, but he didn't give her the chance. He went straight to the reception desk, asked for the doctor by name, and within minutes had arranged everything. He authorized the medication, covered the overnight care, and demanded that Sophia be given the best attention the clinic could provide. Julia stood frozen, caught between fury and relief, her pride screaming at her to push him away even as her heart swelled with gratitude she didn't want to admit. Later, when she entered the room, she found him sitting by Sophia's bed. The little girl's small hand was cradled gently in his much larger one, and he was murmuring words she couldn't quite hear, his head bowed in a posture of raw vulnerability she had never seen from him. There were tears in his eyes, real, unguarded tears, that slipped down his face as he begged the child silently to be strong. Julia lingered in the doorway, shaken to her core. The man she remembered, the one who had smirked at her love and dismissed her dreams, had never shown weakness, never allowed emotion to breach the surface. Yet here he was, stripped of arrogance, stripped of power, nothing more than a father terrified of losing the child he had only just found. The hours crawled by slowly, filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the hushed voices of nurses. Michael never moved from the chair, never let go of Sophia's hand, not even when Julia told him he should rest. He refused food, refused water, his entire focus locked on the fragile little girl in the bed. Julia finally sat down across from him, too exhausted to argue, watching him as he watched their daughter. In that silence something shifted, not in words but in the undeniable truth of his actions. When morning came, Sophia's fever broke. Her breathing eased, her cheeks lost some of their alarming redness, and the doctor declared her out of danger. Relief washed over Julia so powerfully she nearly collapsed, tears spilling freely as she kissed her daughter's forehead. She glanced across the bed at Michael, and for the first time in years their eyes met without anger or bitterness. In that look was a shared gratitude, a recognition of how close they had come to losing everything, and an unspoken acknowledgement that he had been there when it mattered most. Julia knew she could not erase the past. She still remembered the pain of his rejection, the lonely nights when she had wondered how she would manage, the bitterness that had kept her walls high and her heart closed. But she also knew she could not deny what she had witnessed. Michael had stayed, not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but as a father desperate to save his daughter. He had shown her a side of himself she never thought existed, and in that moment, a seed of trust, small and fragile, began to take root once more. As the three of them left the clinic together later that day, Sophia held tightly to both her mother's and her father's hands, while Lily ran ahead, laughing in the crisp morning air. For the first time, they moved not as two people divided by pride and pain, but as something closer to a family. And though Julia told herself she still had reasons to guard her heart, she could not deny the hope rising quietly within her that perhaps change was possible, and that the man who had once broken her could also be the one to help heal what remained. The weeks that followed Sophia's recovery carried a weight of change that Julia could not deny, no matter how much she tried to guard herself. Michael was still present, but not in the way he once had been in her life, towering above her as a man of power who could dismiss her with a single word. He came quietly now, without the arrogance of his wealth, without the distance of his status. She saw him kneeling in the grass beside the twins, letting them braid his hair with clumsy little hands, chasing after them in the park until his tailored suit was stained with grass and dirt. She saw him at the grocery store, filling her cart without asking, his expression calm and steady when she protested, his voice saying only that she had carried the burden alone for too long. She saw him sitting across from her at the diner where she worked, drinking black coffee and waiting until her shift ended, not with impatience but with the kind of patience that had never belonged to the man she once knew. Julia resisted him at first, clinging to the anger that had protected her for years. Every smile from him felt like a temptation to lower her guard, every act of kindness a reminder of the man she had loved and lost. But anger had always been easier to hold than hope, and she realized with each passing day that her walls were beginning to crack. It was not his money that softened her, she had lived without it for years, and she would have continued to do so. It was the way he looked at their daughters as though they were the center of his universe, the way his eyes filled with unguarded love every time one of them laughed or reached for him. He had changed, not with promises or grand speeches, but with quiet persistence, with the humility to stay and prove himself in the smallest, most human of ways. The moment that altered everything came on a late spring afternoon, when Julia returned to the apartment to find Michael sitting on the floor surrounded by the twins. Lily had fallen asleep against his chest, her tiny fist still clutching his tie, while Sophia carefully held a book open, pretending to read aloud though she barely knew the words. Michael looked up as Julia entered, his expression so gentle and unguarded that she felt something inside her break. She realized then that he was no longer the man who had once told her she would never be his wife. That man had been consumed by pride and fear, unable to see beyond his own ambitions. The man before her was different, he was broken in the right places, rebuilt by regret and love, softened by the weight of what he had lost. That night, after the girls had been tucked into bed, Michael asked her to step outside. The street was quiet, the sky washed with the fading colors of sunset, and for a long time he said nothing, as though struggling to find words that could carry the enormity of what he felt. Finally, he turned to her, his hands trembling slightly, and confessed the truth that had haunted him since the moment he first saw her again. He told her how he had been wrong, how arrogance and fear had blinded him, how not a single achievement in his empire had filled the emptiness her absence had left. He told her how seeing their daughters had broken him open, how every day since had been a gift he did not deserve but was desperate to keep. His voice cracked as he admitted he could not undo the past, but he wanted to spend the rest of his life proving he had changed, proving he could be the man she and their children deserved. Then, to Julia's astonishment, Michael knelt on the rough pavement, not in the polished elegance of a boardroom but in the simplicity of the street where her life had unfolded without him. His eyes were wet, his voice unsteady, and he said that while she had once been his assistant, she had always been more. She had been his compass, his anchor, the only person who had ever seen him as more than money and power. He told her she had already been his wife in his heart long before he had realized it, and he begged her to let him make it real, to allow him the chance to be not just a father but her partner, her equal, her husband. Julia stood frozen, tears blurring her vision. She remembered the night he had dismissed her love with cruelty, the years of loneliness, the countless sacrifices she had made alone. She thought of the promises she had whispered to her daughters when they were still growing inside her, promises that she would never let them feel unwanted. And then she looked at Michael, on his knees, stripped of pride, stripped of arrogance, offering not wealth or power but himself, raw and flawed and utterly sincere. In that moment she understood that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, but it meant choosing to believe that people could change, that love could grow even from the ashes of heartbreak. She did not speak at first. Instead, she stepped forward and lifted him from the ground, her hand trembling as she touched his cheek. His breath caught, his blue eyes searching hers, and then she whispered the word he had not dared to hope for, yes. The relief that broke across his face was almost too much to bear, and when he pulled her into his arms, she felt for the first time in years that she was no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. The following morning, when the twins woke to find their parents together, their laughter filled the apartment with a joy that erased every shadow of the past. For Michael, it was the sound of redemption, the proof that love could triumph over pride, that the mistakes of yesterday could be transformed into the hope of tomorrow. And for Julia, it was the sound of healing, the realization that the family she had once believed impossible was now real, whole, and stronger than she had ever dared to imagine.